October 18, 1941, Tokyo, Japan. A German journalist sits in his luxurious apartment sipping whiskey with high-ranking Nazi officials. They laugh. They share secrets. They trust him completely. What they don't know is that in just a few hours, this man will transmit information that will change the course of World War II forever. His name is Richard Sorge, and he is the greatest spy you've never heard of. While the world knows names like James Bond and Jason Bourne, the real master of espionage lived a life so extraordinary, so dangerous, that even fiction couldn't capture its full magnitude. He seduced women to extract secrets. He drank with Nazis while secretly serving Stalin. He predicted Pearl Harbor. And he quite literally saved the Soviet Union from total annihilation. But here's the twist that makes his story truly haunting. The very people he risked everything for didn't believe him. And when he needed them most, they abandoned him to a fate worse than death. This is the story of Richard Sorge, the spy who was too good to be believed. And today, you're going to discover why intelligence agencies around the world still study his methods, why his story remained classified for decades, and why his final words will send chills down your spine. But before we dive into the espionage, the betrayals, and the shocking ending, we need to understand how an ordinary German boy became the most effective spy in history. Because Richard Sorge wasn't born a master manipulator. He was created by the chaos of war, ideology, and a brilliant mind that saw opportunities where others saw only danger. So grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare for a story that proves reality is far stranger than fiction. This is the incredible true story of Richard Sorge, the man who knew too much. Richard Sorge was born on October 4, 1941, in Baku, Azerbaijan, which was then part of the Russian Empire. His father was German, an engineer working for a Swedish oil company. His mother was Russian. From birth, Sorge existed between two worlds, speaking both German and Russian fluently. This duality, this ability to belong to multiple identities, would become his greatest weapon. His childhood was comfortable, even privileged, but when he was 3 years old, his family moved to Berlin. Young Richard Sorge grew up as a German boy, immersed in the militaristic culture of Imperial Germany. He was intelligent, athletic, and charismatic. Everything about him screamed future success. Then came 1914, the Great War, World War I. Like millions of other young men across Europe, 18-year-old Richard Sorge was swept up in patriotic fervor. He volunteered for the German army, eager to serve the fatherland. He believed in duty, honor, and glory. He was about to learn that war offers none of these things. Sorge fought on the Western Front, that hellish landscape of mud, blood, and senseless death. He was a good soldier, brave even, but the trenches broke something in him, as they did for an entire generation. He was wounded 3 times. The third wound, a shrapnel injury to his legs, was severe enough to end his combat service. As he lay in a military hospital in 1916, watching young men die from infected wounds and poison gas, something shifted in Richard Sorge's mind. The propaganda he'd believed, the glory he had sought, all of it seemed like cruel lies. He began reading philosophy, politics, economics, and he discovered the writings of Karl Marx. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the world Sorge was living in. Germany was collapsing. Millions were dead. The Kaiser's promises of quick victory had rotted into years of stalemate and starvation. And then, in 1917, came the news that electrified radicals across Europe. The Russian Revolution. The workers had risen up. They had overthrown the Tsar. A new world seemed possible. For the wounded, disillusioned soldier lying in that hospital bed, Marxism offered something Christianity and nationalism had failed to provide: an explanation for the madness he'd witnessed. The war, according to Marx, wasn't about honor or defending the homeland. It was about capitalists sending workers to die for profit. It was about the ruling class using patriotism as a weapon against the very people they exploited. Richard Sorge became a communist. Not casually, not as a phase. With the same intensity he'd once devoted to fighting for Germany, he now committed himself to the global communist revolution. After the war ended in 1918, Germany descended into chaos. The Kaiser abdicated. Communist uprisings erupted across the country. Sorge threw himself into radical politics, joining the newly formed Communist Party of Germany. He wasn't just a member, he was an activist, an organizer, a true believer. But Sorge was too intelligent, too educated to remain a street-level agitator. He went to university, studying political science and economics in Berlin, Kiel, and Hamburg. In 1919, he earned his doctorate. His dissertation was on Marxist theory. By day, he was Dr. Richard Sorge, respected academic. By night, he was a communist revolutionary, attending secret meetings and distributing illegal pamphlets. And then, in 1924, his life took the turn that would define everything that followed. Soviet intelligence noticed him. The man who would become the greatest spy of World War II was about to be recruited.
The year is 1924. Soviet Russia, still in its infancy, is paranoid and surrounded by enemies. Lenin has just died, and Stalin is beginning his brutal rise to power. The Soviet Intelligence Service, then called the GRU, is desperately building its spy networks across Europe. They need educated, multilingual agents who can blend into Western society. They need people who are absolutely committed to the communist cause. They need someone exactly like Richard Sorge. The recruitment was surprisingly straightforward. Sorge had already proven his dedication to communism through years of activism. His academic credentials gave him perfect cover. His language skills, German and Russian, made him invaluable. And, perhaps most importantly, his personality, charismatic, confident, fearless, made him a natural for intelligence work. In 1924, Richard Sorge officially became a Soviet spy. Let me say that again because it's important. A German citizen, educated at German universities, became a secret agent for the Soviet Union. This wasn't a man selling secrets for money. This was an ideological spy. The most dangerous kind because money can't buy the level of dedication that belief provides. His first assignment was in Moscow. The Soviets needed to evaluate him, to train him, to see if this intellectual truly had the nerve for espionage. Sorge didn't disappoint. He proved to be a natural. Where other agents were nervous or clumsy, Sorge was smooth. He understood something fundamental about spying. The best lies contain mostly truth. The best cover isn't a complete fabrication, it's a careful editing of reality. After his training and initial assignments in Moscow, Sorge was sent to create spy networks in Scandinavia and then Britain. This is where he refined his methodology, the approach that would make him legendary. Sorge's technique was based on hiding in plain sight. Rather than operating in shadows like some skulking criminal, he positioned himself at the center of elite society. He became a respected journalist, a profession that gave him legitimate reasons to ask questions, meet important people, and travel freely. He joined social clubs, he attended embassy parties, he cultivated friendships with diplomats, military officers, and business leaders.
And he drank. God, did he drink. Sorge's alcohol consumption was legendary, even among heavy-drinking journalists and diplomats. But here's what most people didn't understand. Sorge's drinking served multiple purposes. First, it made him seem harmless, just another journalist with a serious drinking problem. Second, alcohol loosened other people's tongues. And third, bizarrely, Sorge was one of those rare individuals who could drink enormous amounts and still maintain complete mental clarity. While his drinking companions became sloppy and talkative, Sorge remained sharp, listening, remembering, filing away every useful detail. But his real genius was in recruitment. A spy working alone can only gather limited intelligence. A spy who builds a network of sources can change the course of history. And Sorge was a master recruiter. He identified people with access to valuable information: embassy secretaries, military attachés, government officials. Then he studied them. What did they want? What were they lacking? Some wanted money. Others craved excitement or ideological purpose. Some were lonely and wanted friendship. Sorge gave them exactly what they needed, and in return, they gave him secrets. In Britain, he successfully penetrated political circles and sent valuable intelligence back to Moscow. But the Soviets had bigger plans for their star agent, much bigger. By the late 1920s, tensions were rising in Asia. Japan was becoming increasingly militaristic and aggressive. The Soviets were terrified of a Japanese attack on their vulnerable Far Eastern territories. They needed intelligence from inside Japan itself. The problem? Japan was notoriously difficult to penetrate. It was a closed society with limited foreign access, high security awareness, and a ruthlessly efficient secret police force. The GRU decided to send their best agent. In 1929, Richard Sorge was ordered to create a spy network in Japan. But there was a problem. Germany and Japan were drawing closer together. Both nations felt humiliated by the post-World War I international order. Both were developing increasingly radical nationalist movements. The Nazis were on the rise in Germany. Japan's military was gaining control of its government. An alliance between these two powers seemed increasingly likely. And that's when Soviet intelligence had a stroke of genius. What if their German agent didn't pretend to be Russian? What if instead he posed as a loyal German journalist, even a Nazi sympathizer? He could build relationships with the German community in Japan, gain their trust, and through them, access both German and Japanese secrets. It was a brilliant plan. It was also incredibly dangerous. If either the Germans or Japanese discovered the truth, Sorge wouldn't just be imprisoned. He would be tortured for information and then executed. Richard Sorge accepted the mission without hesitation. In 1930, he traveled to China first to establish his cover and begin building his network. Shanghai in the 1930s was a wild, dangerous city, full of spies, criminals, and revolutionaries. Sorge thrived there. He made contacts, recruited agents, and perfected his cover story as a committed German nationalist journalist. And then, in September 1933, Richard Sorge arrived in Tokyo. He was 38 years old. He had fake credentials as a correspondent for a prestigious German newspaper. He had letters of introduction to influential Germans in Tokyo. He had a cover story so carefully constructed that even experienced counterintelligence agents couldn't detect the seams. What he didn't have was a spy network. He would have to build one from scratch in one of the most surveillance-heavy societies on Earth. The next phase of his career would either make him a legend or get him killed. Actually, it would do both.
Tokyo, 1933. Imagine being dropped into a foreign country where you don't speak the language fluently, where every foreigner is automatically suspect, where the secret police are incredibly sophisticated, and where your mission is to steal some of the most closely guarded military secrets in the world. And remember, if you're caught, your own government, the Soviets, will deny you ever worked for them. You will die alone. This was Richard Sorge's reality.
And he didn't just survive, he built the most successful spy ring of World War II. His first move was pure genius. He joined the Nazi Party. Yes, you heard that right. The Soviet spy became a card-carrying Nazi. He attended German embassy functions wearing his swastika pin. He gave the Hitler salute. He praised the Führer in conversations with German expatriates in Tokyo. And because his cover was so convincing, because he had genuine credentials as a German journalist and academic, nobody suspected a thing. Within months, Sorge had achieved what seemed impossible. He became friends with the German ambassador to Japan, Eugen Ott. Not just professional acquaintances, genuine friends. They drank together. Their families socialized. Sorge became a trusted advisor, helping Ott understand Japanese politics and military developments. Think about the incredible access this provided. Sorge was sitting in the German embassy, drinking the ambassador's whiskey, reading classified cables from Berlin, attending meetings where German and Japanese military cooperation was discussed. He was at the heart of the Nazi-Japanese relationship, and nobody suspected that everything they said was being transmitted to Moscow. But Sorge knew that one source, even an ambassador, wasn't enough. He needed a network. And this is where his genius for recruitment truly shined. His first most important recruit was a Japanese journalist named Hotsumi Ozaki. Now, Ozaki was no ordinary journalist. He was one of Japan's leading experts on Chinese politics and a secret communist. More importantly, Ozaki was a trusted advisor to Prime Minister Fumimaru Konoe. He attended high-level government meetings. He had access to cabinet discussions and military planning sessions. Sorge and Ozaki created a partnership that would funnel Japan's most sensitive secrets to the Soviet Union for nearly a decade. Ozaki provided information about Japanese military plans, particularly regarding whether Japan would attack the Soviet Union or expand southward into Southeast Asia. This intelligence would later prove absolutely crucial to Soviet survival. But Sorge didn't stop there. He recruited Max Clausen, a German radio operator who could transmit messages to Moscow. He recruited Branko de Vukovic, a Yugoslav journalist who had connections throughout Tokyo's foreign community. He recruited Miyagi Yutoku, a Japanese artist who could move through society without attracting attention. Each member of the ring had specific responsibilities. Ozaki provided political and military intelligence from inside the Japanese government. De Vukovic gathered information from diplomatic circles. Miyagi handled logistics and surveillance. Clausen operated the radio transmitter from various locations around Tokyo. And Sorge coordinated everything, analyzing intelligence, deciding what to transmit to Moscow, and ensuring the ring's security. The operation was remarkably sophisticated. They used coded messages, dead drops, and careful tradecraft. They never met in patterns that could be detected. They maintained their cover identities so thoroughly that their own families sometimes didn't know about their secret work. And through it all, Sorge lived a life that seemed completely incompatible with espionage. He was flamboyant, loud, and notorious. He drove a motorcycle at dangerous speeds through Tokyo streets. He had affairs with multiple women, including the wife of the German embassy's protocol officer. He drank so heavily that people joked about his legendary hangovers. He got into bar fights and motorcycle accidents. This seems reckless, right? How could a spy be so conspicuous? But this was actually part of Sorge's genius. His very visibility made him seem harmless. The Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, had a profile for spies. Quiet, careful, secretive individuals who avoided attention. Sorge was the opposite. He was the life of every party, the drunken journalist everyone knew. This very public persona was the perfect camouflage. Who would suspect that the loudest, most reckless German in Tokyo was actually a disciplined Soviet agent? Of course, the drinking and womanizing weren't entirely an act. Sorge was a genuine hedonist, but he was also a hedonist with perfect control. No matter how much he drank the night before, he would wake up, process intelligence, encode messages, and coordinate his network with absolute professionalism. He was somehow both out of control and completely in control. By the late 1930s, the Tokyo Ring was sending an enormous volume of high-quality intelligence to Moscow. They reported on Japanese military capabilities, political factions, and strategic debates. When Japan and Germany signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, Sorge provided details about the agreement before many German officials in Berlin knew about it. When Japan was debating whether to attack the Soviet Union or expand into Southeast Asia, Sorge transmitted detailed assessments of the internal arguments. But the spy ring's greatest achievements were still to come. Two pieces of intelligence in particular would prove absolutely critical to the outcome of World War II. The first came in 1941. Germany was preparing Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin, despite numerous warnings from multiple sources, refused to believe that Hitler would break their non-aggression pact. He thought the warnings were British disinformation designed to provoke a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. But Sorge was in a unique position. Through his friendship with Ambassador Ott, he learned the exact date of the German invasion. On May 12, 1941, more than a month before the attack, Sorge transmitted to Moscow, "German invasion will begin on June 22, 1941. The intelligence was perfect. It was specific, sourced, and accurate. And Stalin ignored it completely. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German troops smashed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. The Red Army was caught completely unprepared, suffering catastrophic losses. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first weeks. Sorge had given Stalin the exact warning needed to prepare defenses, reposition forces, and avoid disaster. And Stalin had ignored him. The Soviet dictator's paranoia and stubbornness cost millions of Soviet lives. It was one of the greatest intelligence failures in history, not because the intelligence was wrong, but because the leader refused to believe it. You might think this failure would have discouraged Sorge. Instead, he continued his work with even greater intensity, because later in 1941, he would send one more message to Moscow, a message that would literally save the Soviet Union from total defeat. But before we get to that incredible moment, we need to talk about what life was really like for Sorge during these years. Because behind the success and the parties and the secret triumphs, Richard Sorge was living in constant, grinding psychological pressure. And that pressure was about to catch up with him in the worst possible way.
October 1941. The situation for the Soviet Union is absolutely catastrophic. The German invasion that Sorge warned about has been underway for 4 months, and it's going even worse than anyone imagined. German armies are within sight of Moscow. Leningrad is...
October 1941. The situation for the Soviet Union is absolutely catastrophic. The German invasion that Sorge warned about has been underway for 4 months, and it's going even worse than anyone imagined. German armies are within sight of Moscow. Leningrad is under siege. Millions of Soviet soldiers are dead or captured. The entire Soviet state is on the verge of collapse. Stalin is facing an impossible strategic dilemma. His country is being torn apart in the West by German forces, but he also has a massive army stationed in the East facing Japan. These are some of his best troops, veterans, and well-equipped units. Stalin desperately needs these forces to defend Moscow, but he doesn't dare move them, because if he strips the eastern defenses and Japan attacks, the Soviet Union will be fighting a two-front war, and that means certain destruction. Everything depends on one question. Will Japan attack the Soviet Union from the east? Japanese and German leaders have been pressuring Japan to join the war against the Soviets. It makes strategic sense. A Japanese invasion would force Stalin to fight on two fronts. It would split Soviet forces. It would probably lead to total Soviet defeat. Hitler is practically begging the Japanese to attack. Inside the Japanese government, there's a massive debate. Some military leaders want to attack the Soviet Union to seize resource-rich Siberia. Others want to expand south into Southeast Asia to capture British and Dutch colonies rich in oil and rubber. This decision will determine the outcome of the entire war, and Richard Sorge is sitting right in the middle of these discussions. Through his agent Ozaki, who is literally attending the cabinet meetings where this decision is being debated, Sorge has access to Japan's most closely guarded strategic secrets. In early October 1941, the Japanese government makes its final decision. They will not attack the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan will expand southward. They will attack Pearl Harbor and seize Southeast Asia. The decision is absolutely final. Sorge immediately transmits this intelligence to Moscow. He sends multiple messages using different formulations to make absolutely certain Moscow understands. Japan will not attack the Soviet Union. The eastern border is safe. The troops stationed there can be moved west to defend Moscow. This time, Stalin believes him, maybe because the situation is so desperate that he has no choice, maybe because the intelligence is so specific and well-sourced. But for whatever reason, Stalin orders the massive redeployment of forces from the east. Roughly 30 divisions, that's between 300 and 400,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, are loaded onto trains and sent west. These are the crack Siberian divisions, experienced troops accustomed to harsh conditions and brutal combat. They're fresh, fully equipped, and absolutely critical to Soviet survival. These forces arrive just as the Germans are launching their final assault on Moscow. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 and early 1942 is the first major German defeat of the war, and the Siberian divisions play a crucial role. These fresh troops smash into exhausted German units. They launch counterattacks in the brutal winter conditions. They stop the German advance and then push it back.
Moscow is saved. The Soviet Union survives. The entire course of World War II is altered. And none of it would have been possible without Richard Sorge's intelligence. His information gave Stalin the confidence to strip the eastern defenses and gamble everything on defending Moscow. Military historians widely agree that without those Siberian divisions, Moscow would likely have fallen. And if Moscow had fallen, the Soviet Union would probably have collapsed. And if the Soviet Union had collapsed, Nazi Germany would have controlled all of Europe and Western Asia. Richard Sorge's spy ring, operating from a small apartment in Tokyo, changed the outcome of the largest war in human history. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just good intelligence work. This was world historical intelligence work. This was one man and his small network determining the fate of millions. But here's the haunting irony. Even as Sorge was sending the intelligence that would save Stalin's regime, that regime was about to abandon him. Because in October 1941, the same month Sorge sent his crucial intelligence about Japan's plans, the Japanese secret police were closing in on his network. The Kempeitai were very good at their job. They'd been watching suspicious foreigners and Japanese radicals for years, and they'd noticed some inconsistencies, some patterns that didn't quite make sense. It started with Ito Ritsu, a minor member of the communist underground in Japan who was arrested on seemingly unrelated charges. Under interrogation, and let's be clear, Japanese interrogation techniques were brutal. He mentioned knowing someone connected to Miyagi, one of Sorge's agents. The Kempeitai started watching Miyagi. Then they arrested him. Under torture, Miyagi gave up some information about the network. Not everything, he tried to resist, but enough. The investigation expanded. Sorge didn't know it yet, but his spy ring was unraveling. The Japanese police were patient. They were watching, gathering evidence, figuring out the full extent of the network before making mass arrests. They wanted to catch everyone. On October 15, 1941, just days after Sorge sent his crucial intelligence about Japan's strategic plans, Ozaki was arrested. The Japanese government was shocked. One of the prime minister's trusted advisors was a communist spy. The scandal was enormous, but they kept it secret. They didn't want to alert other members of the network. 3 days later, on October 18, 1941, the Kempeitai came for Sorge. Early in the morning, police surrounded his house. They burst in, guns drawn. Richard Sorge, the man who had spent 8 years operating successfully in Tokyo, the man who had just sent intelligence that would save the Soviet Union, was arrested in his own home. The greatest spy of World War II had been caught. And what happened next would be a study in betrayal, courage, and the grinding cruelty of ideological warfare. Sorge knew immediately what his arrest meant. The Japanese didn't arrest people for minor infractions. They had evidence. His network was compromised. And in Imperial Japan, espionage carried only one sentence: death. The Japanese secret police searched his home and found incriminating materials. Not smoking gun evidence, Sorge was too careful for that, but enough to raise serious questions. And they had testimony from other arrested members of the network. The interrogations began. And now we have to discuss something difficult: what Sorge did and didn't say under interrogation. Here's what's remarkable. Sorge did not give up his network. Despite brutal interrogation techniques, despite knowing he was facing certain execution, he protected his sources. He admitted he was a spy. There was no point denying it once they had enough evidence, but he carefully crafted his confession to minimize damage to others. He claimed he had worked mostly alone. He exaggerated his own role and minimized others' involvement. When forced to discuss the network, he only confirmed information the Japanese already had from other sources. He was protecting his people, even as his own life was forfeit. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something profound about Richard Sorge's character. He was a hedonist who loved drinking, women, and dangerous living, but he was also a man of absolute discipline and principle when it mattered. He knew he was going to die, but he could still choose how he died, and he chose to die protecting others. The Japanese kept Sorge's arrest secret. They didn't want the Germans to know that their ambassador's close friend was a communist spy. That would be humiliating. They also wanted to squeeze every piece of information from him before announcing his capture. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearably sad. Sorge waited for rescue. He expected the Soviets to negotiate for his release, to trade captured Japanese spies, to leverage diplomatic pressure. After all, he had just provided intelligence that saved the Soviet Union. Surely Moscow would help him. Moscow did nothing. The Soviet government officially denied that Richard Sorge worked for them. They claimed they had never heard of him. When the Germans asked the Soviets about him, hoping to resolve what was becoming an embarrassing situation, the Soviets said he was not their agent. They abandoned him completely. Why? Stalin's paranoia. The Soviet dictator was convinced that the Germans and Japanese had captured Sorge as part of a disinformation scheme. He thought the whole thing might be a trick to insert false intelligence into Soviet networks. So rather than risk being deceived, he simply pretended Sorge didn't exist. The man who had warned Stalin about Barbarossa, the man who had provided the intelligence that saved Moscow, the man who had risked his life for years serving the Soviet Union, was now officially a non-existent person. Not just abandoned, but denied, erased. Sorge sat in his prison cell and slowly realized that no rescue was coming. The country he had served had thrown him away like garbage, and he was going to die for a cause that now pretended he had never existed.
Sugamo Prison, Tokyo,
November 1941 through November 1944. Nearly 3 years. That's how long Richard Sorge spent waiting to die. Imagine the psychological torture. You spent 8 years running one of the most successful spy operations in history. You've provided intelligence that literally changed the outcome of World War II. You've lived on adrenaline, always one step ahead of discovery, always playing the most dangerous game imaginable. And now, suddenly, it's over. You're in a cell. You're waiting for execution. And the people you served have publicly denied you ever worked for them. The Japanese kept Sorge's arrest secret for months. They interrogated him extensively, trying to understand the full scope of his network and operations. And despite their brutal methods, Sorge maintained a strange kind of dignity. He answered questions in a way that protected his sources while acknowledging his own guilt. He was weirdly honest about some things. He told them, "Yes, I'm a Soviet spy. Yes, I transmitted intelligence to Moscow. Yes, I've been doing this for years." But when they asked him to betray other agents, to give up sources in other countries, to reveal Soviet methods and codes, he refused. He could have made deals. He could have traded information for better treatment or even possible survival. He chose not to. In February 1942, the Japanese government finally announced that they had arrested a major Soviet spy ring. The news shocked both the German and Japanese communities. The German ambassador, Eugen Ott, Sorge's friend, was humiliated. The man he'd trusted, the man who had been in his home, who had advised him on sensitive matters, was a Soviet agent. Ott was recalled to Berlin in disgrace. Sorge's trial began in 1943. It was a secret military tribunal. No international observers, no journalists, no possibility of public outcry. Just Sorge, his Japanese lawyers, and military judges who had already decided his fate. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony from other arrested agents, the materials found in searches, Sorge's only partial admissions. The verdict was never in doubt. But the trial dragged on for months anyway, as the Japanese military tried to understand exactly what intelligence Sorge had transmitted and what damage had been done to their security. Throughout the trial, Sorge maintained his composure. Witnesses described him as calm, even philosophical. He knew he was going to die, so there was no point in panic or false hope. Instead, he used the time to write. He was allowed paper and pencil, and he wrote extensively. Memoirs, political essays, reflections on his life and beliefs. Some of these writings survived, and they reveal a complex man grappling with what his life had meant. He didn't regret his service to the Soviet Union. He still believed in communism, even though the Soviet government had abandoned him. But he was also clear-eyed about the brutality and paranoia of Stalin's regime. He had given everything to a system that was deeply flawed, and now that system had erased him from history.
In his cell, Sorge had plenty of time to think about the irony of his situation. He had predicted Pearl Harbor. In his messages to Moscow in 1941, he had indicated that Japan was preparing for a massive southward offensive, including a likely attack on American forces. Soviet intelligence had shared some of this information with the Americans, though in vague terms. The Americans didn't take it seriously enough. And on December 7, 1941, just 2 months after Sorge's arrest, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Everything Sorge had reported was coming true. Japan was fighting America and Britain in the Pacific. They were not attacking the Soviet Union. The intelligence he'd provided was being validated by events, and he was sitting in a prison cell, officially non-existent, waiting to be executed. The verdict came in September 1943. Richard Sorge and Hotsumi Ozaki were sentenced to death. Other members of the ring received various prison sentences. The executions were scheduled, then delayed, then rescheduled. The Japanese legal system moved slowly, and there were administrative complications. But finally, in November 1944, the execution date was set. 3 years after his arrest,
Richard Sorge's time had run out. On November 7, 1944, Sorge was informed that he would be executed that day. He was given time to write final letters. He wrote to his mother, to his ex-wife, to the woman he'd had a long affair with in Tokyo. In these letters, he was tender, reflective, and resigned. He expressed no bitterness, at least not on paper. He didn't beg or plead. He simply said goodbye. Then they came for him. Japanese guards led him from his cell to the execution ground within Sugamo prison. The method was hanging, the standard execution method in Japan at the time. Here's what we know about Sorge's final moments from prison records and guard testimony. He walked calmly to the execution site. He didn't struggle or cry out. And then, just before the noose was placed around his neck, he spoke his final words. Different sources report slightly different versions, but the most credible accounts say he said something like, "The Soviet people will vindicate me." And then, Richard Sorge, age 49, the greatest spy of World War II, the man who had changed the course of history, was executed. His body was cremated. His ashes were placed in an unmarked grave. Hotsumi Ozaki, his most important agent, was executed the same day. Both men died believing that eventually history would recognize their sacrifice. Both died officially denied by the government they had served. For years, they were right to have doubts about vindication. The Soviet Union continued to deny that Sorge had ever worked for them. His name was classified. His achievements were secret. He had died for nothing, or so it seemed. But the story doesn't end with his execution, because Richard Sorge's final words would prove prophetic in ways he couldn't have imagined.
1964, 20 years after Richard Sorge's execution. The world has changed dramatically. World War II is long over. The Cold War is in full swing. And in the Soviet Union, something unexpected is happening. After Stalin's death in 1953, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, began a process called de-Stalinization. He was revealing some of the terrible crimes of Stalin's regime. He was rehabilitating people Stalin had purged. And Soviet intelligence was finally reviewing old cases, including the case of a German spy who had been executed in Tokyo. A Soviet intelligence officer was going through classified wartime files and came across Sorge's reports. Message after message of incredibly accurate intelligence. The warning about Operation Barbarossa. The crucial information about Japan's strategic plans. Intelligence that had literally saved the Soviet Union. The officer was stunned. Who was this agent? Why had his reports been ignored? Why had he never been acknowledged? The investigation revealed the full scope of what had happened. Richard Sorge had been real. He had been one of the most successful spies in history. And Stalin had abandoned him to die because of paranoid suspicion. The Soviet government faced a choice. They could continue to keep Sorge secret, buried under layers of classification, or they could acknowledge what he had done. To their credit, they chose acknowledgement. On November 5, 1964, exactly 20 years and 2 days after his execution, the Soviet Union officially recognized Richard Sorge. He was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could bestow. His face appeared on a postage stamp. Schools were named after him. His story was taught to intelligence officers as an example of perfect tradecraft. The vindication he had believed would come had finally arrived. But of course, Sorge wasn't there to see it. He had died believing he might be forgotten forever, He had died officially denied, officially non-existent. The recognition came too late for the man himself. But his story became legendary within intelligence circles. The CIA, MI6, Mossad, and intelligence agencies around the world studied Sorge's methods. His techniques for building cover, recruiting agents, and operating under deep cover became textbook examples. What made Sorge so effective? Intelligence analysts have identified several factors. First, his cover was perfect because it was mostly true. He really was a journalist. He really did have academic credentials. He really was German. The only lie was his loyalty. Everything else was authentic, which made the lie almost impossible to detect. Second, his personality was his greatest asset. His charisma, his drinking, his womanizing, all of it made him memorable and seemingly transparent. People thought they understood him completely. He was just that reckless journalist everyone knew. This visibility was the perfect camouflage. Third, his ideological commitment gave him courage. He wasn't doing this for money or personal gain. He believed he was serving the cause of human liberation. That belief sustained him through years of danger and ultimately gave him the strength to die with dignity. Fourth, his network was compartmentalized and careful. Each member knew only what they needed to know. They used proper tradecraft, and crucially, they were all ideologically motivated, which meant there was less risk of betrayal for personal gain.
But perhaps the most important lesson from Sorge's life is also the most tragic. Even the best intelligence is worthless if leaders don't believe it. Sorge told Stalin exactly when Germany would invade. Stalin ignored him. Millions died as a result. This wasn't an intelligence failure. It was a failure of leadership, of judgment, of being willing to hear uncomfortable truths. In Japan, Sorge's story is more complicated. For decades, he was simply the foreign spy who had betrayed Japan's secrets. But over time, particularly after the Cold War ended, some Japanese historians and journalists began to reassess his legacy. They recognized his remarkable abilities and the extraordinary nature of his operation. Today, you can find books about him in Japanese bookstores, and his story is taught as a case study in intelligence and counterintelligence. There's even a small memorial in Tokyo, not far from where he lived, though it's subtle and not widely publicized. Japan's relationship with Sorge's memory remains complex, acknowledging his abilities while obviously not celebrating what he did. His agent, Ozaki, has been similarly reassessed in Japan. Some see him as a traitor. Others see him as someone who opposed Japanese militarism and tried to prevent a catastrophic war. The truth is probably that Ozaki was both, a man who betrayed his country for what he believed was a higher cause. Richard Sorge's life raises profound questions that remain relevant today. What do we owe our countries versus our ideals? Is betrayal always wrong, or can it sometimes be morally justified? Can someone serve an evil regime like Stalin's Soviet Union for genuinely idealistic reasons? How do we judge someone who did terrible things, like espionage and betrayal, for what they believed were good reasons? These are not easy questions. Sorge himself embodied these contradictions. He was brilliant and reckless. He was disciplined and hedonistic. He served a brutal dictatorship while genuinely believing in human liberation. He betrayed Germany while claiming to serve a higher form of German interests through international communism. What we can say with certainty is that Richard Sorge was one of the most effective spies who ever lived. His intelligence changed the course of history. He proved that one dedicated, intelligent person with the right access and the right methods can impact millions of lives. And in the end, his final words proved true. The Soviet people did vindicate him, though by the time they did, he had been dead for 20 years, and the vindication probably would have tasted bitterly ironic to him. Today, Richard Sorge's story serves as a reminder of the real stakes of intelligence work, of the courage it requires, and of the tragic ways that politics and paranoia can waste the sacrifices of those who risk everything. He lived as a man between worlds, between Germany and Russia, between truth and lies, between idealism and brutal reality. And he died alone, abandoned by the cause he'd served, waiting in a prison cell for an execution he knew was coming. But history remembers, and now you know the story of the greatest spy the world has never heard of, the man who saved the Soviet Union, predicted Pearl Harbor, and died officially non-existent. The man who was too good to be believed, Richard Sorge. If this story fascinated you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into incredible true stories that read like fiction. Drop a comment below. Did Sorge make the right choice serving the Soviet Union despite knowing about Stalin's brutality? Was he a hero, a traitor, or something more complicated? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you want to support the channel, check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.